Hi, I'm Kathy Pickar. Welcome to Somerset Stories. Our two guests today are Paige Whitley and David Kathan, who along with Amy Rispin from Brookdale co-authored the paper, The Forgotten African American Community of River Road. Welcome, Paige.
Thank you.
When I read the article, I am impressed by your gift of connecting the dots. To me, you have taken what would have been to me seemingly disparate people, times, locations, events, and you have connected these dots from the colonial period up to mid-20th century and have started to reveal this forgotten African American community. Can you tell us what is basically the geographic area that you're talking about with this forgotten community?
Okay, well, thanks for those kind words. It was fun to do, and it still is fun to do, trying to connect these dots. We're talking about an original colonial tract called Friendship Tract that was about 3,000 acres or more that spanned the land from northwest DC, near Tenleytown, from Fessenden Street northwest to out here in Bethesda, the Edgemore Lane Road. And so that's the original tract. Now, our area is focused as part of that, but you have to understand in the early days, pre-Civil War, large farms, large plantations were favored because Maryland followed its neighbor Virginia and produced a lot of tobacco. Profitable, but also used slave labor to be profitable. Right. And the landowners in the area, you'll recognize names, things like Councilman and Shoemaker and Loughborough, and these names have become streets in our Montgomery County and
right.
DC.
I noticed
these
that,
and
yeah.
such. And some of the big players in our area are names like Loughborough, Councilman. Williams was a plantation farm owner basically on our Somerset tract. He owned 200 plus acres of land where Somerset is.
Oh,
and
interesting.
He also owned slaves and such. So our original community members of the African American River Road community bought land right after the Civil War from Councilman, who owned all of Kenwood and Kenwood Country Club area, and also from these brothers Ray, Benjamin and James Ray, on the other side of River Road where the McDonald's is now and such.
So what brought this African American community specifically to that area? And they bought the land. What was the land like that they bought? Where did they work? I assume were these freed slaves? We're jumping up to post-Civil War.
Well, that's really where the story starts, because documentation truly begins with the deeds of these 8 families purchasing the land. In fact, one of the deeds specifically cites Jane Rivers as colored, when she purchases her 2 to 3 acres of land from the Ray
when
brothers.
You say the founding, these are the African American families that purchased the 8 founders of the African American community.
Exactly. And so we assume they may have been freed slaves from the area. We only have a lead for one specific instance where Mary Ann Wood, the wife of the blacksmith Nelson Wood, they purchased land in 1873 from John Councilman. She is known from later Bethesda Journal articles as having been a child slave of John Councilman and who had been let out to work for a different person, Charles Shoemaker, in the area as a child, okay? And we see marriage documents, we see other documents talking about slave transfers and stuff. So she's a definite instance.
Right.
And we are trying to unravel that for the other families, but I'll tell you, documentation is hard. Slave censuses don't name names for slaves, only the owners. And also some slaves, we believe, changed their names after freedom, okay?
Right.
Off with the
Understandable.
old, new with the new.
Certainly.
So there's that.
What was the land like that they bought? I can't imagine it was prime land, if I had to guess.
Nina Clark, who's a black historian from Montgomery County, and others are quick to point out that the land that was sold to the newly freed blacks often was, quote, the leftover land and or the not prime land, okay, low-lying, prone to floods, or not as great as the prime land and stuff. And so that's the type of land they were buying along what we know now as the Willett Creek,
right?
Okay, in our area. and such. And so, but you have to understand that until the turn of the century, the entire area for both whites and blacks was agricultural. Okay, the census basically shows they're agricultural workers. Okay, of the African American family.
So the African American families were basically agricultural workers for the farms that had
the farms
had slaves
nearby.
previously.
Exactly, and you have a few younger men within the community who are working on the canal as well.
Oh,
okay,
right.
and we have some oral histories from one of the individuals talking about his youth, following along the barges and helping load and unload and take care of the mules and stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
It really is.
Yeah.
So we're talking right now post-Civil War, but let's take it up, since we have to do this in 14 minutes.
Let's move along in history.
Let's go
exactly.
up to,
so turn of the
century,
things change, okay? And there are two big changes that, two things that spark a lot of change. One is the arrival in the late 1800s of railway and trolley systems to the area.
Right.
Okay, there's a freight railroad spur that goes from Bethesda to Georgetown, moving stuff.
Right.
Okay, and that's our Capitol Crescent Trail now.
Right.
So that we
Trails
all take
to
advantage
rails.
of.
Yes.
Exactly. There's also an electric railroad that moves people east and west from beyond Chevy Chase to Glen Echo, because Glen Echo has been built and is now a resort mostly for whites.
Right.
Except on certain days. But the other big thing is the trolley line that goes from Georgetown first to our area outside the Somerset gates on Wisconsin Avenue, supposedly, but later extending to Rockville. And that all of these things are moving goods and people in and out. And what it means for the area is that it moves from agricultural to more. Okay.
Right.
And so we have the introduction after the 1900s of Alan E. Walker buys the old Loughborough Quarry, which is kind of where Ernie's auto shop and stuff is.
Right. Oh, yeah, right.
And he sets up the Bethesda Blue Granite Country. On the other side of River Road, where the Washington Episcopal School is, in the 1920s, the George Fuller Stone Company sets up a plant that they're shaping, they're importing Indiana limestone to shape and cut for the Supreme Court building and for Washington National Cathedral, things like that.
Well, one of my favorite stories.
I got to get to the other big thing that moved was in the late 1890s, the USDA.
This is my favorite story.
The USDA basically received complaints about the sheep, goats, horses, and cows and everything else that would wander along the National Mall as part of its jurisdiction of maintaining the health of the nation's husbandry. And they bought 50 plus acres of a farm to set up the USDA Veterinary Experimental Station. That's Norwood Park. And that's why Somerset was founded by USDA scientists and clerks and others. I always thought they liked fresh air in the country.
I did too.
It's because they were working nearby.
They were familiar with the area.
And the USDA vet station was a huge employer for the workers. At least 6 to 7 heads of family from the African American community would stroll along the railway line just up the street to the farm and work there as laborers and stuff.
Tell our viewers about the story of the zebra.
So one of the newer residents who married into the community. So people are moving
the African American community of River Road.
The African American, 3 brothers moved down from Seneca, the Clipper brothers, and that's why we have Clipper Lane off River Road. They set up 3 houses there, and 2 of them worked at this vet station. Okay, and William Clipper later in life boasted that he had ridden a zebra down Wisconsin Avenue. Now I took this as hyperbole until I read old newspaper articles talking about a gift of an Abyssinian zebra to the president,
that's great.
And that it was going to go to the zoo, but first it was being sent off to the vet station.
Sure, we couldn't have zebra diseases coming in.
There we go. So that's true. So all of this transportation and other mix in the USDA, the economy changes from agrarian, and now we start seeing more heavy and other industry. And not only are people joining the African American community as it grows and they're marrying into it, also we start seeing our suburbs grow. Somerset, West Chevy Chase, American University Park, as people are taking those trolley lines and other things and moving out to this area.
I want to back up just a little bit because in an earlier show we referred to the founding of Somerset by the 5 scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And
Salmon was one of them.
Dr. Salmon was one of them, and he is the one who discovered salmonella. Exactly. And I had always thought, just like you, oh, they must have liked the fresh air. They were modern day. At their time, they were modern day developers.
That's
but
what
I
thought.
see now they were familiar with the area because they worked at the station in Norwood Park.
They knew what was going on, exactly.
That's interesting. What was going on in the way of, as the I assume the African American community, the forgotten community, was growing.
Yeah.
What was happening with education? Where did the children go to school?
I think you can agree that around the world throughout history, people see education as a way to help their children have a better life.
Right.
Okay, and stuff.
Right.
And so as the community grew, they too were pushing for education for their children. You got to remember, Montgomery County is separate but equal.
Right.
Okay, system. In the teens, they are given money by the Board of Education, but only to rent space in one of the members' homes. The son of Mary Ann Woods, the former slave, Frank Woods, rents space, and there's a school in his home. The Board of Education provides for a teacher and books. But the community keeps, requesting a real building. Right. And it's not until 1925 when, frankly, some land owned by a descendant from one of the founding families, Edward Warren, that land falls into arrears.
Now, when you say founding families.
Right, one of the original African-American families who purchased land along River Road. This is like sort of behind McDonald's. And some of the land goes up for auction. The Board of Education purchases the land. And then in 1925, with contributions from the community, the land that the Board of Education now has, and funds from the Julius Rosenwald Foundation,
right,
create and build a school that opens in 1926, okay? And our resident, David Stern, is the great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald. You know what? I just learned recently that in 1931, 27% of all African-American children in that year in the United States were educated in a Rosenwald school. That's like a third of all population for blacks.
And for those who, I hope most people are familiar, but the Rosenwald schools were by the Julius Rosenwald Foundation, and Julius Rosenwald had his fortune from Sears Roebuck.
Exactly, yeah, he did. But he was really smart about his philanthropy.
Yeah.
It was initially started because he donated to Booker T. Washington, and he's the one who thought, let's build some schools. But it was well documented, well overseen, and it always involved community involvement. Okay,
right. And I know in your article you have a lovely picture of the Rosenwald School. Where did it stand generally?
Sadly, it's easy to pick out because it's more or less where that big, tall, ugly radio tower is that blinks at night and stuff, sort of in that area of land behind McDonald's and near the Willett Stream. But I have a good story about it. So the school was used, and it was called the River Road Colored School, and originally only had up until 5th grade and later until 7th grade. And it was in constant use until desegregation. Desegregation occurred in 1954. The school was closed in 1955, and children were integrated in the nearby white schools, like Somerset Elementary School. But a great story is that granddaughter of Mary Ann Woods, Frank's daughter, she's amongst the first graduating class of the colored school. And she goes on to become an educator there, and after desegregation at Cabin John. So we've got a lovely story there about
You know what?
Woods.
In about 30 seconds or less, I know we are not doing justice to this incredible amount of research that you've done. But can you tell us what happened? When was the last land that was owned by the African American community sold? And then after you tell us that, we're going to pick up in the second portion of the show with David Kathan.
World War II. The 40s changes things, heavy industry leaves, and there's fewer jobs, even though people are increasing in the community. They can't buy in the surrounding communities. And what happens
when
is
you say they, you're talking about
we're talking about the African Americans because of racist covenants in the communities around cannot expand out beyond this small area of land between Ridgefield and Little Falls Parkway, basically. The last two families, Rivers and Woods, finally sell out in the 1960s.
And we're going to pick up there in the second part of this show as to bring us up to the current time and what is going on. Thank you so much, Paige.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We will return to Somerset Stories after a brief message. Thank you.
every day across America. Excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Before we begin the second part of this show, I want to give you a little background on what our next guest, David Kathan, will be talking about. In 2014, a real estate development company amassed a large amount of land just west of River Road in the Westbard area. And that prompted a new sector plan, which had the requisite rezoning. And in the process, historians in the county, when they were working on the new sector plan, referred to an African American cemetery in the area that was to be developed. Little Falls Watershed Alliance is an organization that's dedicated to preserving the environmental fragility of the area around the streams. They were concerned that this redevelopment of Westbard take into consideration this sensitive area and basically to daylight the streams, to restore the streams, and specifically not build too close to the streams. To that end, they asked Paige Whitley and David Kathan to begin some research into where this cemetery was that the county historians had referred to. Was it in the area close to the stream? And when they did the research, it started uncovering, as you know, from the first segment, far more than just what the cemetery was. David and Paige and the third author, Amy Rispin, shared their research with the Macedonia Baptist Church, which is a little church on the hill right off River Road, and is symbolically probably the only thing left of the forgotten African American community. After they shared their research with the members of this church, the Reverend Adebayo, who is the pastor of the church, have taken it. They are the public voice now going forward and working with the county to assure that the memory of this community is restored and that the cemetery is preserved and memorialized. So David, welcome.
Thank you.
With that background, tell me about the cemetery. What was its name? Who was there? What are the origins of the cemetery?
Well, the name of the cemetery is generally referred to as the Moses Cemetery. We have chosen to call it the River Road Moses Cemetery. The history actually goes back a bit. From when we first looked at it, we only knew there was a cemetery there. And then by looking at deeds, old real estate maps, we were able to find that there indeed was a cemetery there, and then it had a name of a group called the Ancient United Order of the Sons and Daughters of Brothers and Sisters of Moses.
Oh.
It was, and there was a fraternal group called the Whites Tabernacle Number 39, who was a member of that larger fraternal society that had purchased this land in 1911. And when we started digging a little further, we found out it was even a longer history back in Tenleytown.
What was the longer history back in Tenleytown?
Well, in Tenleytown, right around Fort Reno,
right,
where now the Fort Reno Park, there was what was known as Reno City. And it was a concentrated African-American community around the turn of the century,
right,
after Civil War. And associated with that, there were churches, schools, and a cemetery.
In Tenleytown area?
In the Tenleytown area. And the fraternal society was associated with that cemetery. And when that area became developed, or by Chevy Chase Land, they needed to, the land was purchased for the cemetery, and they needed to move the bodies.
So they purchased the tabernacle, purchased the land then off River Road.
That's right.
So they could move their cemetery to a cemetery, as I understand it, already existed.
Yes.
And was it already called the Moses
Yes.
Cemetery?
There was other names that were given for it, Christian Cemetery, Moses Cemetery, but about 192 burials, we believe, were there.
Already?
Already there in Tenleytown.
This was, okay.
In Tenleytown.
Right.
It took an act of Congress to actually allow them to move many of the bodies because there were no next of kin. These were, former slaves where there may not have had any, parents or children who would know who these burials were. So by that point, the 1920s, we believe, moved those remains to River Road.
Wow. As I look at, in your article, you have some wonderful maps, and there were several historical cemeteries that are dotted on your map. Were all of these African-American cemeteries? I should say these are in about a 1-mile radius from the D.C. line through the River Road area.
There are 7 we have found thus far.
And you all have found these cemeteries?
Well, actually, there were 2 that were already known. So there were 7 in total, 2 that were known by the county, and were on what's known as the cemetery inventory.
Right.
And that was the Samuel Shoemaker, which is on near Bayard Road, and also the Busey Posey Cemetery. Essentially, at this point, it's vacant lots up near Springfield Road.
So these were not the African-American cemeteries?
No. There were 2 that we've now found that were African-American. The Moses Cemetery.
Correct.
And then associated with the Woods, the Nelson Woods, Marianne Woods that Paige was talking about, we found in a real estate plot, there was another cemetery. And
interesting.
So it was a family plot. Most of the others, except for the Moses Cemetery, were family plots. People were buried in the backyards.
So as far as we know, the Moses Cemetery began around the time that this African-American community was founded, post-Civil War.
We suspect that there were burials on that location because it was back there in land that wasn't being used for anything else. It was not particularly good land for any kind of agriculture or the cultivation. So we suspect there were families like the Warrens, the Rivers, who probably had some burials on that location. And it's perhaps why it was purchased, and sold as a cemetery.
Interesting. So how do you find records of who was buried in this cemetery? Do you know of any, well, you just mentioned, you know of a few actual names of people who were buried there?
We suspect, and we do know, it's very hard to answer your first question, to find names, especially in African-American cemeteries.
Right.
And especially the story I was telling about the unidentified bodies. So we don't know most of the names there, except for a few. And the best one we found, and really kind of is a good indication that there was a cemetery there, was a woman by the name of Cora Botts. And there was a 1935 death notice, which identifies that she was buried at Moses Cemetery. But the reason why that's a great evidence is because her husband was one of the trustees of White's Tabernacle, number 39.
Going back to
back to
Tenleytown. I love this connecting the dots that you all have done. Is there any? Let's jump forward. Is there any official record that the cemetery, which the Moses Cemetery off River Road, was ever moved?
We have
from there.
So the land was purchased in 1911.
For the cemetery.
For the cemetery. There were no records, as far as we can tell, from the move from Tenleytown to River Road. In 1958, the land was sold again. The White's Tabernacle, whatever was left of that group at that point, sold the land to real estate developers. And at that point, we have not been able to find any records of any movement of bodies from there. There's some oral history of some families that may have been moved, but there is no. We've looked in the funeral home records. We've looked at the county level. The county historians have done a similar type of research. There is no record of any movement.
And if a cemetery had been moved, there should be a record, correct?
There should be. And then what then happened is when in 58 was sold, and then the West
1958.
1958, yes. At that point, Laszlo Tauber developed the whole Westwood area, where the Giant is, and so by the late 60s, he built the Westwood Towers right next to the cemetery. And at that point, during the excavation of parking lots that were on leased land right next to the Westwood Towers, there are oral reports of burial bones being found, and uncovered. So that leads strong credence that there indeed were remains still on site, and they were not moved.
How did you know that? Did you have deed, for example, when the White's Tabernacle bought the land for the cemetery, did it show in a deed specifically where it was? How do you know? Yeah.
Oh, the deed record is actually very, very good in terms of, in the 1911 deed, in 1958. And actually, even went past 1958, the name of the land is still referred to as White's Tabernacle, the number 39, or Ancient United Order, So there clearly is, good evidence that it was purchased by the Fraternal Society. And there's also reference in various news articles referring to it as a cemetery during that period.
Where was the Macedonia Baptist Church that's symbolically sort of represents the last of the African American community that was there and forgotten? When did that come into play? When was that founded?
We've done some research and looking at deeds, but also we've seen some of the history developed by the church itself. They came into Bethesda around 1920, right on Elm Street near Bethesda Row.
Yeah.
And then they moved to River Road in around 1930s, in mid-30s.
I see.
And they moved to the present location, to the little church on the hill,
right,
in 1945-46.
And I know you have shared, you and Paige and Amy have shared your research with the little church on the hill. Is there any evidence of burials of their church people in the Moses Cemetery?
We have not found any yet, but I think that both the church and the cemetery serve the community.
Yeah.
So I
right.
believe some of the people
Sure.
who were original members of the church,
yeah.
when it moved to River Road, probably did have at that point, relations who were buried in that location.
This is all wonderful information, and I want people to know that this article will be published in I believe it's called the History Journal of the DC Historical Society, coming up this fall. And where else can we find further information about this topic? And also, briefly, can you tell us where we are today?
Well, you can, if you want more information, go to www.lfwa.org. Little Falls Watershed Alliance is the group that Paige and I and Amy have been working with in doing this, and so they will have more information there. Now, where are we right now? There is still, to be determined, what will be happening to the cemetery land. There are still discussions, mediation actually, going on between the county, the Equity One, now Regency developer, to determine what to do about the land. Right. The developer wants to put up a building on the cemetery, and there's also a new legislation that just proposed by 3 councilmen at the county level to ensure this may not happen again.
Which would be wonderful. Thank you so much, David, and I want to thank Paige as well for joining us on Somerset Stories. Thank you for joining us today on Somerset Stories, and we look forward to seeing you on our next show.